We now have Alex Waechter coming to talk to us about the journey of a bird record, and Alex is the current manager of the Herts Environmental Record Centre and has been heading a small team at HERC, as it's called, for coming up 6 years. She's been working in nature conservation in the UK for over a decade. Her educational bedrock is in physical geography, overlain by superficial deposits of experience with mapping software. I'm enjoying all the puns. Database management and programming. An interest in biodiversity and wildlife was seeded from a young age. Her professional life has taken that interest from the early successional phase into a more mature appreciation for ecological processes and the connections between landscape, habitat, niches and organisms. Thank you very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say, Alex. Thank you. Please welcome her.
Thanks, Rupert. I have to say, Tim asked me to write that introduction at the end of a long work day, and some of that was the silliness that comes of getting kind of tired. So thanks for the introduction and to the committee for inviting me to do the talk today. If you haven't heard, if there's anyone in the room who hasn't heard of the Herts Environmental Record Centre, we are the county repository of information on habitats, species and important sites for wildlife in Hertfordshire. We have, throughout our history, worked very, very closely with the Herts Natural History Society and a few of the other local recording groups to help ensure that data being collected by these societies is made available as widely as possible. In addition to the Bird Club and the Natural History Society, we do also receive data from a few other places, such as professional ecologists, members of the public who are engaging with things like iRecord. And we also have a data management role. We collate, we check, we cross-reference the species data, and we have a data dissemination role. We are the local one-stop shop for all things biodiversity data, which leads us into the topic of today's talk quite nicely, which is the journey of a record. What happens to your observations after you submit them to the Bird Club website? I'm here to answer all the questions you didn't know you had. So that little graphic I put together initially just as a bit of decoration for the title card, but I was looking at it and actually it's not a bad representation of a slightly idealized journey of a record. I was going to make this an interactive exercise with asking you to put your hands up and whatnot, but actually the talks today already have really fed into so many parts of this process that I don't think I need to do that. But if we do go through it, starting at the bottom left here, I'm sure we all know what the bird and the binoculars represent. I'd be worried if we didn't. So we've got the bird doing bird things. Observation and identification. This one is also probably also fairly obvious, submitting records. Then we've got verification that happens. And we've already heard talk today of the rarities panel and the rare birds panel, both locally and nationally. So that's part of the process, an important part of the process. The next icon might be a little bit less familiar if you're not in the data management, but that is meant to represent databasing. Once we start getting into the quantity of records that birders generate, add them to the rest of the quantity of records that naturalists generate, you do start needing some specialist software. And the tools that you can bring to data management by using a database really extend your capability of working with it. Next symbol, probably also relatively obvious, which is starting to get into what does the data show you. And specifically, I've meant this to refer to things like atlases and species trend analysis. So where are our species? Are they faring well? Are they declining over time? Those kinds of questions. And then there's a question mark, which kind of leads on from this in a way, because once you know what species are rare and what species are threatened and declining, the next question then becomes, okay, well, what do we do about it? If they start to have status, so then people start asking questions like, okay, if I want to do activity X at location Y, how is that going to affect these rare and threatened species? And to help answer those questions, we might start combining data with other data layers like land use and habitats designated sites, proximity to things that could be a pressure. That analysis hopefully informs on-the-ground action, mitigating negative impacts, increasing opportunities, so that hopefully, too far, so that hopefully we continue to have birds doing bird things and hopefully have more birds doing more bird things. I say this is slightly idealized because I think Graham's first talk tonight was really illustrative how in the latter half of that curve, the informing on-the-ground action to actually ensure species recovery, survival, often depends on people with willpower and activity, energy, to make it happen. The systems that are in place for considering biodiversity and development and so many of these things have good principles behind them, but they do depend on people with energy to actually make sure that things follow through. So this is what we're aiming for, and theoretically we have this process in place in this country. We are so lucky to have this process in place in this country where people like naturalists out on the ground looking at things, amassing this vast quantity of knowledge about their local areas and their local species can feed into a wider decision-making process. When we look at this cycle, there are a few different roles within it. Data starts with the observer, and then it gets passed to the bird club, the rarities panel, and it gets added into the bird club's database. The bird club, as we know, produces the annual report, this conference, and has really the expert knowledge of how our local bird species are faring. I've included BTO in this as well, because obviously the bird club sits as a local unit within a much larger framework of recording schemes. So the work of the bird club and the BTO are obviously very closely intertwined, as it should be. But then on the right side of this, once we start getting into making data available to inform site assessments and land management decisions, this is really where the records center comes in. I put another little database icon there because we take a copy of the data from the bird club database, import it into our database, and that's where we can start working with it and making it available. We are also able to cross-reference it with our other data holdings, species records from other taxonomic groups, habitats, our network of sites, and we have the skills and capacity to undertake some analysis when people ask us questions about the county's biodiversity. Here's another question up at the top. I framed these in terms of questions. I wasn't kidding when I said it was answers to questions you didn't know you had. Who uses it once it's on the HERC database? We have a very different audience from the BTO or the Bird Club Committee. We heard a little bit about this actually just from the previous talk about how the survey that's being designed by the BTO is about amassing information that then can be analyzed to help answer some research questions about, in that case, the importance of urban green space generally for bird species. That kind of research arc sits really nicely with the Bird Club, with the BTO, and the more kind of national research bodies, not research bodies, but recording schemes who look at those kinds of questions. Once it gets to the local environmental records center level, our audience is really the people doing site assessments and thinking about land management. So we do about 800 data requests a year from professional ecologists who are doing assessments for planning and development control, biodiversity net gain, and things like that. We're increasingly seeing requests that are related to things that are not traditionally development, things that might be related to habitat creation schemes, woodland grant schemes, just general impact avoidance or mitigation from operational works, from things like larger companies that do operational groundworks. We also get requests from site managers who are looking at creating management plans, forestry professionals doing woodland management plans. We're hosted by the Hearts of Middlesex Wildlife Trust, so obviously they're a pretty significant user of the data on our database. And then we also get requests from members of the public, people who just kind of want to know what's on their doorstep. They're concerned about a planning development next door and want to know what might be known about that site, that kind of things. What kinds of questions do we get asked? Some things we do ourselves, some things we are fully aware of our limitations and we'll refer back to the recording groups like the Bird Club. But these are three questions, genuine questions that we have had in the past year or two. First one there is, can we map the fields that are used by farmland birds in order to create a mapped action in the new local nature recovery strategy for this? And the people who asked me to have a stab at doing this were the Local Nature Recovery Strategy Partnership Mapping Group. It stands out for me because it actually turned out to be a really difficult one. And effectively the answer was no, I can't tell you what fields are used by farmland birds. The best that I could do was identify fields that intersect 1 kilometer squares that had records of farmland birds. And in order to do that, I had to, I ended up having to have a really good look at the grid references on quite a few of the mostly older bird records for the farmland birds. Because ones that had been submitted with a bird club site name only those positions were not reflective of where the birds actually were. And I think farmland birds are probably the worst case scenario for this because in a lot of cases it wouldn't be this bad, but up in the northeast, the bird club sites tend to coincide with the settlements. And obviously the settlements are not where the arable fields are. So, what was that example that came up often? Again, there's some dung heaps, I think, along the road from Ashwell to Iworth, which I'm sure many know. Obviously, those records that get pinned to Ashwell or to Iworth are quite some distance from the fields that those birds are using. I was able to go through those records and do a bit of a correction on the position estimate because a lot of those records had comments with really quite some really good locational detail in them. So by spending the time going through the comments, I was actually able to do a better job of this analysis than I would have been able to do otherwise. But it was quite time consuming. It was an example of the kind of question we get asked. We had a stab at doing the analysis. There was a lot of data to work from, but it was difficult to do. The next question on that list, what is the last known breeding location for nightingale in the county? This one came from the comms team at HNWT. On the face of it, it's quite straightforward. But the ease of answering that depends on being able to easily identify which records are breeding records. And again, this has already come up today. Using those breeding activity codes, taking that information and putting it into a really structured format is so incredibly useful. Because when you've got a large quantity of records, it takes a long time to read comments. Having that data in that structured format is so incredibly useful. And then the last one I've got on there is a bread and butter question that any record center will get asked on a regular basis, which is just, what species have you got that are known to use this site? These are often not the Sherrod's Park Woods and the Ballswood and the Hitchwoods. These might be much more modest woodlands that might not have their own bird club site. So our ability to answer that question really depends on the accuracy of grid references that are on a record. For management plans, it is quite important to know whether a species uses a site and hasn't just been observed from close to a site. That distinction ends up being quite critical. And for management plans, the most useful data of all are records that provide information on how a bird is using a site and what features are they using, and is that something that's critical to their life cycle. So again, putting detail in the comments is one way of providing this information, which many of you do, and it is good. But if you up the precision of your grid references to maybe 10 meters, it's actually even better. because then site managers can map those records onto their other data holdings and draw conclusions and a picture that way of what's going on. So they might know where their different habitats are within a site. They might know where their veteran trees are and where their ponds are. They might know where they've carried out management activities like scrub clearance or grass cutting. So when they can map high-resolution species data on top of that, you can start to really build up a really complete picture of how species are using a site in question and what the effects of certain management decisions might be. And yeah, like I said, when you've got a lot of data, those types of things make it much more efficient to work with it than working through the comments. This is not a talk that I would necessarily have to have with every group of naturalists in the county. Some of the invertebrate specialists can quite freely put data in the comments because we might only ever be reading 30 of their records. But the birding community is so prolific and it's so wonderful. It's a wonderful problem to have that there's almost too much data to work with. But at this stage, this is when adding value to records by using structured fields, by using the breeding codes, and by providing accurate and precise grid references, really starts, pushing the boundaries of how well and effectively that data can be used. And it's kind of the next step of how we can continue to build our knowledge of these species and their habits. I've already mentioned these. What might stop my records being used as widely as they could be? And these are the three things that I want to pick up with. So putting information in the free text comments is a little bit of a barrier. It is useful to have there, but it is a little bit of a barrier. If it could be better placed in a structured field like the breeding code or contained in a more precise grid reference. That's on the second one there. The third one I just wanted to mention briefly, because it's something that is unlikely to have occurred to anyone before, is non-commercial licensing. This is not an issue if you submit your data through the Bird Club website because the licensing on it is freely open. But if you are an eBird user, the default licensing is non-commercial. And the knock-on of that is that data can't actually be used for commercial activities, which unfortunately covers some of what we do as a record center, but also covers all of the professional ecology work that goes into planning and development and site management. So if it's something that you have control over within your individual account settings, it's definitely worth having a look at to see if you can open up that data more. I've already said it all. What can I do as a recorder to make my data as useful as possible? Grid references, use the breeding codes, use this idea of structured data fields, and then use the Natural History Society website if you can. The form on there is really good, and we have the potential to further improve it for collecting more structured data, hopefully in consultation with you guys. And I think there are plans and a hope to make it more mobile friendly and make the map widget a little bit better. So it's something, we've got control over it and we can continue to work to improve it. And thanks for listening. That was all I wanted to say. We are also here to support the recording community. So if you ever have anything you'd like to ask us, you are free to do so. Please drop us an email.
Great, thank you very much. Very grateful to Alex. She's working hard to sharpen our data collection and make it as useful as possible. And this just comes with a massive encouragement to put your records in via the website. I suppose we pride ourselves on the data. We're the local experts, so to speak, and those records will get checked. They'll make their way to HERC and become very useful, especially when it comes to planning decisions and all of that kind of stuff. So we are very grateful.